On our newscast this evening, President Park Geun-hye repeats that she won't get involved in the months-long political deadlock at the National Assembly, while the parliamentary speaker decides to open a plenary session next week. It's been 1 year since the Kaesong Industrial Complex reopened its doors after a more than 5-month shutdown. We take a look at where things stand today. The U.S. launches its first airstrikes against Islamic State targets in Iraq since President Obama outlined his new strategy against the threat. Stay tuned for these and more on an early edition at 6.
It's 6 in the evening on Tuesday, September 16th here in Korea. Welcome to Early Edition at 6. I'm Hyun-kyung.
And I'm Daniel Choy. Thank you for joining us. We begin at the political realm here in Korea. President Park Geun-hye spoke up against this Tuesday on the parliamentary logjam created by the so-called ferry bill.
She reiterated her earlier stance that she cannot get involved while the National Assembly Speaker stepped in with hopes of untangling the situation. Choi You-sun has tonight's top story.
President Park Geun-hye was very clear in her first response to calls from the opposition party that she step in to resolve the current legislative deadlock over a probe into April's ferry sinking.
지금 진상조사위원회에 수사권과 기소권을 주자는 주장에 대해 일부에서는 대통령이 결단을 하라고 합니다. 하지만 그것은 삼권 분립과 사법 체계의 근간을 흔드는 일로 대통령으로서 할 수 없고 결단을 내릴 사안이 아닌 것입니다.
Political discord over the issue has suspended parliamentary affairs for months, with the victims' families demanding that the committee stated in the bill have more power in the investigation. The president instead said the second bipartisan deal on the bill, which the opposition backtracked from last month, should be accepted. She also urged the National Assembly to quickly get past the ferry bill standoff and focus on improving people's livelihoods and national safety management. President Park relayed her position to the ruling party leadership at her office later in the day. With neither the ruling nor the opposition side willing to budge more than 2 weeks into the Assembly's regular session, Speaker Chung Lee-hwa took matters into his own hands.
The speakers decided on the Assembly's regular session schedule as the ongoing parliamentary paralysis with a lineup of pending bills has run counter to the people's wishes.
The standing committees, with or without the opposition, are expected to resume on Wednesday, with the ruling party aiming to pass other economic and reform-related bills at a plenary session on September 26th. Choi You-sun, Arirang News.
And today, North Korea sent a second formal request to the presidential office of Cheongwade, demanding that it stop allowing propaganda leaflets to be flown over the border into the north. A South Korean government official said that North Korea's National Defense Commission sent a letter on Monday following another that was sent last week. Now, both letters said Seoul needed to put a stop to the balloon launches of anti-Pyongyang leaflets if it wants to hold another round of high-level inter-Korean talks. The South replied on Sunday to last week's letter, saying the government has no legal recourse for stopping private organizations from flying the leaflets. The announcement out of Washington after talks between the national security advisors of South Korea and the U.S. is that there is no announcement. There had been expectations that the two allies would lay out the timeline for delaying the transfer of wartime control from Washington to Seoul this week, but it's not likely to come until next month at the earliest. Our Kwon So-ah has this report.
The timing and conditions for the transfer of wartime operational control from Washington to Seoul are still under discussion, despite expectations of an extension from next year's deadline to around 2020. High-level defense talks between National Security Advisor Kim Kwan-jin and his U.S. counterpart Susan Rice are ongoing in Washington, and both sides have agreed not to specify a set date for the transfer yet, deciding that it's best to continue monitoring the situation. South Korea's defense ministry said Tuesday that the two allies are aiming to announce an agreement at the annual South Korea-U.S. Security Consultative Meeting in October. It's the same message that emerged after talks last month between Deputy Defense Minister Ryu Jae-seung and U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia David Helvey. Both are said to have assessed the South Korean military's response capability against North Korea's nuclear threat, which is the very reason the OPCON transfer had earlier been delayed to 2015, following Pyongyang's third nuclear test in February last year. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
In a piece penned for Korea Chair platform on Monday, former Pentagon strategist Van Jackson said South Korea needs to divert more resources to bolstering its defenses. The editorial was published on the same day a drone, presumably from North Korea, was found in waters off South Korea's west coast. The South Korean military says it was similar in appearance to a North Korean drone found in the south earlier this year. Jackson called on Seoul to adapt to the emerging threat North Korean drones pose by developing a better counter-drone system while also working more closely with Washington. The 69th UN General Assembly gets underway on Tuesday in New York City, and the topic garnering the most attention in South Korea is the human rights situation in North Korea. A foreign ministerial meeting on the issue will be attended by South Korea's Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, Japanese Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida, and many other European foreign officials. In a rare move, North Korea will send its Foreign Minister Lee Soo-yong to New York to rebut the argument and defend its human rights conditions. Now, the move for open international discussions about the issue comes after failed attempts to secure the release of 3 American citizens detained in North Korea.
One year ago today, it's already been a year since the two Koreas agreed to resume operations at their joint Kaesong Industrial Complex. Nearly 6 months after the North unilaterally shut it down,
And that resumption was possible only after the two agreed on a set of measures to improve the management of the business park. Now, for more, we are joined by our Unification Ministry correspondent Hwang Sang-hee live in the studio. So, Sang-hee, have those measures been effective?
Not really, Hyun-kyung. When operations resumed at the Kaesong Industrial Complex, the two Koreas agreed on a set of measures to better manage the complex, which included easing regulations for South Korean commuters, allowing the use of internet and mobile phones, and attracting foreign investors. Well, a year has passed with very little progress. I went out to the inter-Korean border this morning to talk to South Korean commuters to Kaesong on their view on this issue. Take a look.
It's 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and these cars are making their daily commute to North Korea. They're South Korean workers who work at the Kaesong Industrial Complex.
It wasn't until a year ago that the South Korean workers were allowed to cross this border again. That's after North Korea unilaterally shut down the complex for 6 months amid heightening inter-Korean tensions.
The workers say not much have changed since then.
The security checks on vehicles is even tighter than before. They even check underneath the car seats.
If mobile phones were allowed, the internet will be available. That would be very convenient.
The 125 South Korean businesses in Kaesong are still struggling, with their total production volume at just 80% of what it was before the shutdown. Park Geun-hye, who runs a textiles factory, is among them.
We lost trust from our clients, which caused considerable damage. It will take a long time to recover. We had to compensate the clients on last year's losses.
Some blame the heavy South Korean sanctions against the North.
Because new investments in the complex are blocked in principle, the companies have trouble expanding their business.
Well, the sanctions were imposed back in 2010 after a North Korean torpedo attack on a South Korean warship. Now, it bans all South Korean investments in the north, which shuts out new businesses from entering Kaesong and which in turn restricts the growth of the business park.
Right, we thought that more foreign presence, having more foreign companies in the zone might prevent any further suspensions in the future. But how are the efforts to globalize the joint economic park coming along?
Well, Daniel, around 30 foreign firms from countries like Germany and China have shown an interest in opening up factories in Kaesong, and around 3 or 4 of them have actually visited the industrial zone to look into investment opportunities. But concerns over another unilateral closure are holding them back, and experts say the globalization process would gain momentum if governments were to step in.
If the Chinese government is more actively involved in bringing Chinese firms to the complex, the globalization process will be much more smooth.
In fact, Norwegian officials and businessmen visited Kaesong in May, and a delegation of Russian trade officials toured the industrial zone earlier this month. But experts add that as long as hurdles like North Korea's nuclear program and inter-Korean tensions remain, any eye-opening growth at the Kaesong industrial zone is unlikely anytime soon.
So still a lot needs to be done to bring the quality of the joint complex to an international level at this point.
Right.
I know you were there early in the morning. Thank you so much for bringing us this report, Sung-hee. We hope to see you back here with something more interesting again.
It's a one-day entry ban. 77.
Digging deeper, getting to the bottom of stories that impact your life. Talking with you on air and online. Connecting you with experts on the world's most pressing issues. News and current affairs at its best. With Hyun-kyung and Daniel Choy.
Arirang News. Arirang News.
On Early Edition at 6.
Amid warnings that the Ebola outbreak in West Africa is out of control, the United States is preparing to announce a new set of measures to help stop the spread. It's also called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, which will sit down later this week to discuss an epidemic that has so far killed 2,400 people and threatens to kill many more. Our Song Ji-sun has this report.
Washington is beefing up its support of international efforts to get the West Africa Ebola outbreak under control. The White House said Monday that President Barack Obama will travel to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on Tuesday to meet with health officials about the epidemic and afterward announce an expansion in the number of military and medical resources to combat its spread. The measures are expected to include up to an additional 3,000 U.S. military personnel being dispatched to West Africa, along with the launch of a major healthcare training and hygiene program. The U.S. will also set up a command post in the Liberian capital of Monrovia and help build up to 17 Ebola treatment centers in the region, with a total of about 1,700 beds. As chair of the UN Security Council this month, the U.S. called for an emergency meeting this Thursday, asking member countries to come with concrete commitments to tackle the outbreak. This is only the second time in history the Council has met to address a public health crisis. The first was in 2000 when they convened over the AIDS pandemic. The World Health Organization earlier issued a warning about the Ebola outbreak, saying that the number of afflicted patients was increasing exponentially and that all the new treatment facilities have been overwhelmed. Song Ji-sun, Arirang News.
Starting an expanded military operation against Islamic State militants as laid out by U.S. President Obama last week, the U.S. has launched airstrikes near Baghdad. This as officials from Western and Arab powers were wrapping up talks in Paris to form a coalition aimed at helping Iraq defeat the extremist group. Our Park Geun-hye has this report.
The U.S. has expanded its aerial bombing campaign to target IS militants near Baghdad. It was the 162nd round of airstrikes by the U.S. in Iraq since early August, but the first since Washington's move to form a global coalition against IS and the first in direct support of Iraqi forces fighting the militants. On the diplomatic front, some 30 Western and Arab countries, including Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, gathered for the Paris summit, where they pledged to provide military support to Iraq to help the war-torn nation defeat Islamic State militants. Iraq's President Fuad Massoum, co-host of the conference, said action must come quickly. France, host nation of the summit, has already begun surveillance flights over Iraq in preparation for further military action. French fighter jets taking off from United Arab Emirates flew over Iraq on Monday on a reconnaissance mission. Iraq's Kurds, who have scored some significant victories over IS in recent weeks, welcomed the global efforts to quash the extremists.
This summit in Paris is a historic summit, especially for the Kurdish people and the government. It is a very important step to destroy IS with help from friendly countries such as the great powers France, the US, and Britain.
However, the summit's joint communique made no mention of Syria, the other country IS controls large parts of. Neither Syria nor its main ally Iran were represented at the summit, mostly assembled by the U.S. While the U.S. warned Syrian President Bashar al-Assad not to interfere with potential U.S. airstrikes inside his country, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on Monday expressed his discontent with the U.S. coalition from a hospital where he had just undergone prostate surgery.
In the last few days, we've had some excitement, and with that excitement, we've been hearing from American officials making comments on forming a state, which are blank, hollow, and self-serving, and lack in any direction.
Although Iran says it supports the Syrian and Iraqi government's fight against the militants, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said last week that it would be inappropriate for Tehran to join the global coalition because Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Moving over to Britain, Scots will head to the polls on Thursday to answer a simple question on whether Scotland should be an independent country. British Prime Minister David Cameron, in his final pitch in Scotland, urged its 5 million citizens not to pull out of the United Kingdom after more than 300 years. He stressed a breakup would be a painful divorce and not a mere trial separation, and reasoned with critics that any qualms they have against his government can be addressed and changed. Although Buckingham Palace clarified that Queen Elizabeth II remains neutral, she broke her silence on the matter on Sunday and urged Scots to think very carefully about the future. Opinion polls on the referendum remains too close to call. Shifting gears now, international awareness of Japan's wartime sexual slavery is growing, with Beijing joining in on the global campaign. China is now the second country outside of Korea to unveil a statue honoring survivors of Japan's sex crimes. Our Kim Min-ji has the details.
An elderly woman is reminded of her past sufferings as she stares at a monument of a girl who's shown cowering while covering her face. China has unveiled its own statue dedicated to the women forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military during wartime. It's the first such statue in China in honor of the victims, known euphemistically as comfort women. The monument follows in the footsteps of similar ones in Korea and the United States. Currently, there are 2 statues in the U.S., one in the California city of Glendale and another in the Detroit suburb of Southfield. Both are replicas of the peace monument that Korean civic leaders set up in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul nearly 3 years ago. The organizers of China's statue did not mention where it will be located, but the unveiling coincides with the release of The Eyes of Dawn, a Chinese movie that is based on the victims' stories and the pain and suffering they were forced to endure at the hands of the Japanese military. Around 2,000 women, mostly Koreans, were forced into sexual servitude by Japanese soldiers during World War II.
The movie reenacts scenes from history and carries the message to never forget.
The movie, which hits the screens in China later this week, is expected to shed light once again on Japan's wartime atrocities and the Japanese government's failure to fully make amends. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
And shifting our focus to economic news, there is mounting criticism in Korea that the government is bombarding low-income people with cigarette and local tax hikes. And a recent report shows Korea may be pretty soft on higher-income earners compared to other nations. According to a report by the OECD, Korea's income tax to GDP ratio stood at 4% in 2012. That's the third lowest level among the 28 OECD member states surveyed. Countries with the highest income tax ratios were Denmark and Iceland, where the figures stood at 24% and 14% respectively. Korea's corporate tax to GDP ratio, however, was the fourth highest among OECD member states at 4%. Now, if you ask two people about the impact of new Finance Minister Choi You-sun's expansionary policies on the economy, it's very likely that you might just get two different answers. While some believe that the so-called Choinomics has provided a much-needed boost for the markets, others say the jury is still out. Our Kim Ji-yeon has the details.
It's been 2 months since the appointment of Choi You-sun as finance minister, and his expansionary policies to spur growth are starting to produce results in some areas. For one, the country's benchmark Kospi reached an almost 3-year high at the end of July. The stagnant real estate market is also showing signs of improvement, and the number of housing transactions jumped more than 5% in July from the previous month. However, some argue the economy has some way to go before it's back on path to a firm recovery. July's coincident and leading composite index, which indicates the health of the economy, was just over 100 and 101 respectively, unchanged from the previous month. A reading over 100 means that there are more optimists than pessimists on the economy. A reading under 100 indicates the opposite. The nation's job market hasn't really picked up either. In August, 594,000 jobs were created from a month earlier, but the majority of these jobs were part-time positions, and they're mostly filled by people in their 50s. On top of this, the real GDP growth rate grew a mere 0.5% on quarter, the lowest in 21 months. As a result, economic institutes, including the state-run Korea Development Institute, are reportedly considering lowering their growth projections for this year. 10 international banks have already cut their growth forecast for the Korean economy by 0.1 percentage point on average to 3.7%. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Pre-orders of Apple's new iPhone 6 and 6 Plus have topped 4 million on the first day. That's double the number for the iPhone 5 released in 2012. Apple says deliveries will begin at the end of this week, but because demand overruns the supply, some will have to wait until next month to get a hold of the new gadget. Now, both the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus feature larger screen sizes and a longer battery life. This comes after the tech giant unveiled the two models along with its wearable iWatch last week. Analysts had said the sales of the newest iPhone handsets would top 9 million in the first weekend.
And now the weather. It was a mild day here in Seoul and all across the nation, in fact.
Well, let's turn to our Michelle Park for the latest weather forecast. Michelle, we are seeing a wider temperature gap between day and night these days, aren't we?
That's right, Hyun-kyung, and those temperatures will continue to drop into the evenings and the morning hours. And as you can see here, we are expecting about a 10-degree temperature drops, putting the lows into the teens. And due to the large temperature gaps, more people are getting sick. And here are some of the tips for staying healthy. Get enough sleep at night, get enough sunshine during the day, and of course eat well. And they're very simple, but all will help you fend out those colds. Now looking ahead, unlike today, we can expect a cloudy day tomorrow nationwide, and rain is also in the forecast in the southern regions and on Jeju Island. And due to the cloud cover, temperatures won't be rising as high as today, ranging in between the low 20s to the mid 20s. Now going over to our temperature readings for tomorrow. So we'll start off the morning at 18 before reaching up to 24 degrees in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Daegu and Busan will see the highs of 24 and 25 degrees. Now moving over to other regions, Jeju Island peaks over to 26, while Dokdo and Mangkeung stays cool at 21 degrees. Now that's all for now. Michelle, Park Geun-hye, have a wonderful evening.
Get enough sleep, get enough sunshine, all simple, but sometimes it's hard to do and stick to those principles for some reason.
Definitely. The easiest things are always the hardest sometimes. Well, thank you for that, Michelle, and that's all we have for you at this hour. And thank you for staying with us. If you're watching in from different time zones, do have a wonderful day. This has been Daniel Choy.
And I'm Hyun-kyung, wishing our viewers in Korea a great rest of the evening. Daniel and I will be back at the same time tomorrow.